The sun-baked plains of Nevada stretched toward the horizon like an endless sea of gold, swaying under the summer wind as Colton Waite guided his dun stallion through the valley. Blood crusted beneath his fingernails, and a 3-day beard shadowed his face, remnants of a cattle drive that had left him more hollow than the year before. It was 1875, and the promise of Carson City beckoned just beyond the ridge. 5 years since he'd last ridden through. 5 years of drifting across the territories with little more than his horse, his rifle, and the ghosts that kept him moving. They called him the silent rider in the last outfit. He'd worked a man of maybe 25 words a day, and most of those directed at his horse. The war had taken his voice, or so he sometimes thought. Not in the physical sense, but in all the ways that mattered. 8 years since Appomattox, and still he found little worth saying in a world that had buried too many good men. A flash of yellow caught his eye as he guided his horse around a bend in the trail. The sound came next, a soft, melodious voice floating on the breeze. Colton's hand instinctively moved to his Colt revolver, easing it in its holster as he approached. What he found stopped him cold. A woman knelt in a meadow of wildflowers, her honey-brown hair falling loose around her shoulders. Her simple blue calico dress pooled around her as she leaned forward, speaking in conspiratorial whispers to a cluster of bright yellow buttercups. Her face, what he could see of it, was alight with something he hadn't witnessed in years. Pure, unbridled joy. "You're looking mighty fine today," she was saying to the flowers. "Standing tall and proud, aren't you? That's right, drink in that sunshine." She reached out one slender finger to touch a petal. "You're braver than folks give you credit for, pushing up through this hard ground." Colton remained frozen atop his horse, uncertain whether to announce himself or simply ride on. He'd almost decided on the latter when the woman's head turned, and eyes the color of summer sage met his. "Oh," she straightened, smoothing her skirts as she rose to her feet. No fear in her face, just mild surprise and something that might have been amusement. "I didn't realize I had an audience." Colton touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, but said nothing. "Were you planning to sit up there all day, or were you going to introduce yourself?" she asked, her head tilting to one side. He cleared his throat. "Madam." It came out rough like gravel underfoot. Her smile widened. "Well, that's a start." She gathered a small basket from the ground beside her. "I'm Hannah King. I collect wildflowers for my father's apothecary in Carson City." Colton nodded once. "And you are?" she prompted. "Waite," he managed. "Colton Waite, Mr. Waite," she repeated, trying the name. "Are you headed to Carson City?" Another nod. Hannah studied him, seemingly undeterred by his reticence. "You don't say much, do you, Mr. Waite?" His shoulders lifted in the barest suggestion of a shrug. "The flowers don't mind," she said, gesturing to the meadow around them. "They're excellent listeners. Sometimes I think they understand more than most people." She bent to pick a delicate purple bloom. "This one, for example, desert lavender. It knows how to survive the harshest conditions. Bends but doesn't break." Colton watched her slender fingers work, carefully adding the stem to her collection. "Are you in need of work, Mr. Waite? My father could use help with deliveries. Our last assistant left for the silver mines last month." The unexpected offer caught him off guard. He hadn't planned to stay in Carson City, hadn't planned much of anything beyond finding a saloon and a cheap room. But winter would arrive before long, and steady work was hard to come by. "I can pay you Friday evenings, and there's a room above the shop if you need it," she continued, filling his silence with possibilities. "Why?" The question escaped before he could stop it. Hannah's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Why hire you?" "Well, you haven't shot me yet despite me chattering away, which shows remarkable restraint. You look capable. And," she added with unexpected candor, You have sad eyes, Mr. Waite. I find I'd like to know why. He shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Too forward? She asked, with a small smile that suggested she knew the answer. My father says I need to learn when to hold my tongue. I say life's too short for pretense. She gathered her basket and started walking toward the trail. The apothecary is on Carson Street, just past the Silver Dollar Saloon. King's Remedies. If you're interested, come by tomorrow morning. She was several paces away when she turned back. And Mr. Waite, the buttercups would tell you that sometimes the brightest things grow in the unlikeliest places. With that, she continued down the path, her blue skirt swishing against the tall grass, leaving Colton to wonder what sort of woman spoke to flowers and offered jobs to silent, trail-worn strangers. The next morning found him standing outside King's Remedies, his hat in his hands. He'd bathed, shaved, and put on his one clean shirt. The shop was neat but modest, its front window displaying bottles of various shapes and colors. A bell jangled as he pushed the door open. A man with spectacles and a neatly trimmed white beard looked up from behind a counter. Good morning. What can I help you with today? Colton cleared his throat. Hannah, she mentioned work. Recognition dawned on the older man's face. Ah, you must be Mr. Waite. Hannah mentioned meeting you yesterday. He extended his hand. Howard King. My daughter has a knack for finding strays, though they're usually of the four-legged variety. Colton's handshake was firm but brief. Not staying long, he managed, just until winter passes. Howard nodded thoughtfully. Fair enough. Can you raid, right? A nod. Good. The deliveries need proper documentation. Can you handle a wagon and team? Another nod. Excellent. I'll pay $8 a week, plus room and board if you need it. Deliveries go out Mondays and Thursdays. The rest of the time, I'll need help around the shop stocking, cleaning, that sort of thing. Hannah handles the mixing and preparation of most remedies. Before Colton could respond, the back door opened, and Hannah entered, her arms full of dried herbs hanging in bundles. Oh. Her face brightened when she saw him. Mr. Waite, you came. Something twisted in Colton's chest at her genuine delight. Madam. I told you he didn't talk much, she said to her father with a smile. Indeed. Howard gave his new employee a considering look. Well, Mr. Waite, shall we show you where you'll be staying? The room above the shop was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that faced east toward the mountains. Better than he deserved, Colton thought as he placed his meager belongings on the bed. A photograph in a tarnished frame his parents, long dead, a battered copy of Thoreau's Walden, a harmonica he hadn't played in years. We eat supper at 6, Hannah said from the doorway, respecting the threshold of his new space. Nothing fancy, but it's filling. He nodded his thanks. Mr. Waite, she hesitated, then continued, I hope I wasn't presumptuous offering you work like that. Sometimes I speak before thinking. Colton shook his head. It's fine. Her eyes widened slightly at receiving 3 words instead of 1. Well then, I'll leave you to settle in. That evening, sitting at the King's table in their modest home behind the shop, Colton felt distinctly out of place. The table was set with simple but matching plates, a far cry from the tin plates of trail camps. Hannah and her father maintained an easy conversation that flowed around him like water around a stone. Mr. Waite, Howard said eventually, Hannah tells me she found you on the North Trail. Where were you coming from, if I may ask? Wyoming, Colton managed, cutting his meat with precision. Cattle Drive. That's a long journey, Hannah remarked. Were the wildflowers as beautiful there as they are here? The question was so unexpected that Colton actually looked up from his plate. Different, he said after a moment. More blue ones, lupines, she nodded. They carpet the high country in summer, like the sky fell to earth. The image was so accurate that Colton found himself nodding. Yes. Hannah's smile was warm. See, father, 3 whole words at once. I told you he could speak when properly motivated. Howard chuckled. My daughter has always believed she could charm words from stones, Mr. Waite. You needn't feel obligated to prove her right. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Colton felt the ghost of a smile tug at his lips. The days fell into a pattern. Mornings were for loading the wagon with remedies and tonics bound for outlying ranches and mining camps. Colton would carefully check Howard's neat handwriting on the delivery lists, securing the bottles in straw-lined crates. Mondays and Thursdays, he'd be gone from dawn until dusk, navigating the network of trails that connected Carson City to the scattered settlements beyond. The work suited him. Alone with the wagon and team, he could breathe easier, free from the expectation of conversation. The customers along his route quickly learned he wasn't one for small talk, accepting their packages with a nod and sometimes a gruff afternoon, if he was feeling particularly sociable. When not making deliveries, he swept the shop, organized the storeroom, and repaired whatever needed fixing. Hannah worked alongside him often, grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle, measuring tinctures into bottles, or wrapping packages in brown paper and twine. She talked constantly, not to him, specifically though she included him in her one-sided conversations, but to everything around her. The plants she worked with received the most attention. You're looking particularly vibrant today, she would tell the chamomile as she snipped its flowers. All that sunshine did you good, didn't it? To the mint. Stop trying to take over the entire garden. The time needs room too, you know. And once, to a batch of willow bark. Now you behave yourself and release all that good medicine. Mrs. Peterson's joints are paining her something fierce. Colton found himself listening for these peculiar conversations. They made more sense to him than most human interactions, filled as they were with simple truths and observations, rather than the complex social dance he'd never mastered. One quiet afternoon in late September, as golden light slanted through the shop windows, Colton was repairing a loose shelf when he heard Hannah's frustrated sigh from the workbench. These valerian roots are being particularly stubborn today, she muttered. Won't yield their essence no matter how nicely I ask. Without thinking, Colton approached, looking over her shoulder at the wooden bowl where she was attempting to mash dried roots. Wrong tool, he said quietly, reaching past her to a different pestle on the shelf. This one was heavier with a broader base. Harder wood, better leverage. Hannah stared at him in astonishment, not just at the tool he offered, but at the unexpected string of words, 7 of them all at once. It was practically a speech. Thank you, she said, taking the pestle from his hand. Their fingers brushed, and Colton stepped back quickly, returning to his shelf repair. But later, as he was sweeping the floor before closing, he heard her speaking softly to the successfully processed valerian. I have Mr. Waite to thank for helping me convince you to cooperate, she told the powder. He knows more than he lets on, that one. Something warm and unfamiliar stirred in his chest. October brought cooler weather and changing leaves. Howard began preparing the shop for winter, ordering extra supplies before the mountain passes became treacherous. Hannah spent more time gathering late-season plants, preserving what she could for the months ahead. Would you come with me tomorrow? She asked Colton one evening as he was heading up to his room. There's a stand of juniper on the east ridge that I need to harvest, but it's farther than I usually go alone. He nodded, not trusting himself with words. The next day dawned clear and cool. They set out on horseback, Hannah riding a gentle, dappled mare, her basket secured behind her saddle. The mountains rose before them, their peaks already dusted with early snow. I love autumn, Hannah said as they rode. Everything preparing for rest, showing their true colors before they sleep. Colton glanced sideways at her. The morning light caught in her hair, bringing out strands of copper and gold. For once, she wasn't looking at him, her attention on the landscape, giving him freedom to observe unnoticed. Though I suppose some might find it melancholy, she continued. The dying of the year and all that. Not dying, Colton said, surprising himself. Just waiting. Hannah turned to him, her eyes bright with interest. Waiting. Yes, that's much better. Waiting beneath the snow until it's time to return. She studied him with new appreciation. You're a poet at heart, aren't you, Mr. Waite? He snorted, shaking his head. No, I mean it, she insisted. Those who speak little often see much. I think you understand the language of waiting. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds their horses' hooves on the trail and the occasional cry of a hawk circling above. When they reached the stand of juniper trees, Hannah dismounted gracefully and tied her mare to a low branch. These berries are essential for winter remedies, she explained, reaching up to touch the blue-gray fruits. They help with coughs, stomach ailments, all sorts of things. Colton watched as she spoke softly to the trees, thanking them before she began to carefully harvest their bounty. It wasn't like the nonsensical baby talk some people directed at plants or animals. Her words were thoughtful, almost reverent. "Why do you do that?" he asked finally, the question that had been burning in him since their first meeting. Hannah paused, berries cupped in her palm. "Talk to them." "Because they're alive. Because they give so much and ask for so little in return. Because—" she hesitated, suddenly self-conscious. "Because after my mother died, the flowers were the only ones who didn't tell me to stop crying." Colton felt something shift inside him, like soil giving way to a seedling. "I was 12, she continued, returning to her harvesting. "Consumption took her. My father threw himself into his work, creating remedies, always searching for the one that might have saved her. And I went to the garden. The roses she'd planted were blooming, and I was so angry that they could be beautiful when she was gone." Her voice softened. "I told them so, and do you know what happened?" Colton shook his head. "Nothing miraculous. They didn't speak back. But the wind came, and their petals brushed against my cheek, almost like—" She touched her face at the memory. "Almost like she was comforting me through them." They worked in silence after that, Colton helping reach the higher branches, Hannah directing which berries were best to gather. When her basket was full, they sat beneath the trees to rest before the journey back. "Your turn," Hannah said, offering him a strip of dried apple from her pocket. Colton accepted the fruit with a questioning look. "To share a story," she clarified. "Fair's fair." He chewed slowly, buying time, uncertain what she expected. Finally, he said, "Not much to tell." "I don't believe that for a moment." Her voice was gentle but persistent. "Where did you learn about the right tools for grinding herbs?" A long silence stretched between them. Hannah waited, patient as the juniper trees. "My grandmother," he said at last. "She was, like you, knew plants, spoke to them sometimes." Hannah's face lit up at this small offering. "Was she the one who taught you to listen more than you speak?" Colton almost smiled. "No, that was the war." Understanding darkened her eyes. "You fought, Union cavalry, 4 years." She didn't push for more, but something about the quiet beneath the juniper trees, the sharp, clean scent of the berries in her basket made him continue. "Too many words during war, orders, screams, prayers. After a while, none of them meant anything." Hannah nodded slowly. "And afterward," Colton looked toward the mountains, "couldn't find words worth saying. Until now." There was no expectation in her voice, just quiet curiosity. He met her gaze, finding himself unable to look away from those sage green eyes. "Until now," he agreed. On the ride back to Carson City, Colton found himself pointing out things he normally would have kept to himself, a red-tailed hawk circling above, the tracks of a fox crossing their path, the way the sunlight hit a particular rock formation. Small observations, barely worth mentioning, yet Hannah received each one as though he'd offered her gold. That night, in his room above the shop, Colton took out the tarnished harmonica he hadn't touched in years. He held it to his lips and blew softly, wincing at the rusty sound. But he continued, working through Shenandoah slowly, the familiar melody gradually finding its way back to his fingers. Below, in the king's living quarters, Hannah paused in her reading, lifting her head at the faint music. She smiled to herself and returned to her book, allowing him the privacy of his rediscovery. November arrived with its short days and biting winds. Business at the apothecary picked up as colds and winter ailments spread through Carson City. Colton's delivery routes became more challenging as mud turned to frost, but he took satisfaction in knowing the remedies he carried brought relief to isolated homesteads. Howard began teaching him the basics of the business, which tonics served which purposes, how to properly wrap glass bottles for transport, even how to mix some of the simpler preparations. Colton absorbed the knowledge silently but thoroughly, surprising the older man with his retention and care. "You have a steady hand," Howard commented one day as Colton measured drops of tincture into vials. "Better than mine these days." "Practice," Colton said with a slight shrug. What he didn't mention was that the shaking in his hands, a remnant of the war that had plagued him for years, had gradually subsided during his time in Carson City. One afternoon, as the first snow of the season began to fall, a frantic knocking came at the shop door. Hannah opened it to find a young boy, no more than 10, his face flushed with cold and exertion. "Please, Miss King," he gasped. "Ma says come quick. The baby's coming too early and she's bleeding something awful." Hannah's expression turned serious immediately. "Bobby Jenkins, isn't it?" "Your ranch is on the East Road," the boy nodded frantically. "Pa sent me on our fastest horse, said to bring you back no matter what." Hannah turned to Colton, who was already reaching for his coat. "I'll need my birthing kit," she said, all business now. "And the blue bottle on the top shelf, the one with the dark liquid." Howard emerged from the back room, his face grave. "I'll prepare everything. You two go immediately." Within minutes, Colton had hitched the wagon and Hannah climbed up beside him, her medical bag clutched tightly in her lap. The snow was coming down harder now, the wind picking up as they left the shelter of the town. "The Jenkins place is about 5 miles out," Hannah said, her voice tight with worry. "Their closest neighbor is 3 miles beyond that." Colton nodded, urging the horses to a faster pace. The boy had already ridden ahead on his mount, eager to return to his family. "I've never done this alone before," Hannah admitted quietly. "Father always comes with me for difficult births." Colton glanced at her, surprised by the confession. "But Mrs. Jenkins needs help now, and Father's joints pain him too badly in this weather to make the journey." She gripped her bag tighter. "I just pray I remember everything he taught me." The miles passed slowly through the thickening snow. By the time they reached the Jenkins ranch, a good 2 inches covered the ground, and the sky promised more to come. A man rushed out to meet them as they pulled up to the small cabin. "Thank God you've come," he said, helping Hannah down from the wagon. "She's in a bad way, Miss King." Hannah's professional demeanor took over. "Mr. Waite, please bring my bag and come in. I may need your assistance." Colton followed her into the cabin, momentarily blinded by the transition from snowy brightness to the dim interior. Heat from a blazing fireplace hit him, along with the unmistakable metallic smell of blood. A woman lay on a bed in the corner, her face gray with pain, a blood-stained sheet covering her lower body. Two small children huddled together on a bench near the fire, watching with wide, frightened eyes. Hannah went straight to the woman's side, speaking in low, soothing tones as she examined her. Colton stood awkwardly by the door until Hannah beckoned him over. "I need clean water as much as you can heat," she instructed. "And those cloths from my bag. Mrs. Jenkins is going to need our help bringing this baby into the world." For the next 3 hours, Colton witnessed Hannah transform from the whimsical woman who spoke to flowers into a determined healer fighting for 2 lives. She worked with quiet intensity, her hands sure despite her earlier uncertainty. She spoke constantly not just to her patient, but to the unborn child as well. "You hold on, little one," she murmured as she worked. "Your mama's fighting so hard for you, just a little longer now." When the bleeding worsened, Hannah didn't panic. She administered the dark liquid from the blue bottle, applied compresses, and continued her gentle but insistent coaching. Colton found himself recruited to help hold Mrs. Jenkins upright, to fetch more water, to wring out bloodied cloths. Finally, as the storm howled outside and the light faded from the day, a tiny, angry cry filled the cabin. "A boy," Hannah announced, her voice thick with emotion as she quickly wrapped the undersized infant in clean linen. Small but mighty from the sound of him. Mr. Jenkins sobbed with relief, pressing his wife's hand to his lips as Hannah placed the swaddled baby on his mother's chest. The crisis wasn't over. Hannah worked for another hour to stop the bleeding and ensure both mother and child were stable, but the worst had passed. When she finally stepped away from the bed, Hannah's face showed her exhaustion, but her eyes shone with quiet triumph. She washed her hands in the basin, then checked on the older children, reassuring them that their mother and new brother would be all right. Outside, the snow had piled high and darkness had fallen completely. "You can't travel back tonight," Mr. Jenkins insisted. "The trail will be near impossible to find, and there's wolves been heard lately. Please stay until morning. It's the least we can do." Hannah looked to Colton, who nodded his agreement. The thought of navigating the snowy darkness with an exhausted team held little appeal. They were given blankets and offered space near the fire. The Jenkins children, relieved and curious about their visitors, brought Colton a cup of coffee before their father shooed them to bed. "You were remarkable," Colton said quietly when they were alone by the fire, the rest of the household finally sleeping. Hannah looked up in surprise at the unexpected praise. "I was terrified," she admitted, "but there wasn't time for fear, was there? They needed help. You spoke to the baby," he observed, "like you do with the plants." A tired smile curved her lips. "I suppose I did." "Everything alive understands kindness, Mr. Waite. Words of encouragement matter, whether you're a flower pushing through soil or a baby fighting to be born." She studied him in the firelight. "Even taciturn cowboys respond to them, I've noticed." Colton felt heat rise in his face that had nothing to do with the fire. "Hannah," he said, her given name feeling strange and right on his tongue, "thank you." "For what?" "For showing me this." He gestured vaguely around the cabin at the sleeping family they'd helped. "A different kind of purpose." Her eyes softened. "You've been looking for one," he nodded, finding it easier to speak in the semi-darkness with the storm creating a cocoon around them. "After the war, just drifted. One cattle drive, then another, moving without going anywhere. And now." The question hung between them, fraught with meaning beyond its simplicity. "Now I'm here," he said finally, "listening." Hannah's smile was like sunrise. "That's a fine place to start, Colton Waite." They returned to Carson City the next morning, the world transformed by a blanket of pristine snow that sparkled in the sunlight. Howard was relieved to see them, having worried through the night as the storm raged. Both alive and well, Hannah reported of mother and child. It was close, but they pulled through. And you? Her father asked, looking between Hannah and Colton with keen eyes. You both look different somehow. Hannah laughed, dismissing his observation. Just tired, father, and perhaps a bit proud of our night's work. But something had shifted between them during those hours in the Jenkins cabin. Colton found himself watching Hannah more openly now, noticing the graceful movement of her hands as she worked, the way she tucked stray hairs behind her ear when concentrating, how she hummed softly to herself when she thought no one was listening. And Hannah, for her part, began including him more deliberately in her conversations with the plants and remedies. "What do you think, Mr. Waite?" she would ask as she arranged dried herbs. "Does this rosemary seem particularly fragrant to you today?" Gradually, Colton found words coming more easily. Never many at once, but enough to respond, to participate, to exist more fully in the world Hannah and her father had created in their small corner of Carson City. December brought preparations for Christmas. The shop was decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, and the scent of cinnamon and cloves filled the air as Hannah prepared festive remedies and tonics. Business was brisk as townsfolk purchased gifts and supplies for the holiday. One evening, as snow fell gently outside the windows, Howard announced he was going to visit his friend Judge Parker for their weekly chess game. "Don't wait up," he told Hannah with a wink. "Parker's wife is making her famous applesauce cake, and you know how that tends to extend our matches." After he'd gone, an unusual quiet settled over the shop. Hannah was at her workbench, writing labels for a new batch of remedies. Colton sat nearby, repairing a leather strap on one of the delivery harnesses. "Will you tell me about your grandmother?" Hannah asked suddenly. "The one who knew about plants." Colton's hand stilled on the leather. "What do you want to know? Anything you remember. What she grew, what she taught you." He set the harness aside and leaned back in his chair, searching through memories he'd long kept locked away. "She lived in Pennsylvania. Small farm, had a garden that seemed endless when I was a boy." Hannah smiled encouragingly. "What did she grow?" "Everything. Vegetables for eating, flowers for beauty, herbs for healing." He closed his eyes, seeing it again. Rows of lavender that buzzed with bees. Peppermint that escaped its boundaries every summer. Roses climbing the fence. "It sounds beautiful." It was. He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. "She talked to them too, said they listened better than most people." Hannah's expression softened. "A wise woman. She died before the war." Thankful for that, at least. She didn't have to see what became of. He trailed off, unwilling to follow that thought. "What became of you?" Hannah finished gently. Colton nodded once, sharply. Hannah rose from her workbench and came to sit in the chair beside him. "What do you think she would say to you now if she could see you?" The question caught him off guard. He'd never considered it. "I think," Hannah continued when he didn't answer, "she would see a man who endured terrible things but didn't let them destroy his capacity for kindness. Who still notices which pestle works best for valerian root. Who drove through a snowstorm to help a woman and her baby." "Hannah," he began, not knowing how to continue. "I see these things, Colton," she said, using his given name for only the second time. "Even when you don't have words for them, I see them." Something long frozen inside him began to thaw, painfully but necessary as spring breaking through winter's grip. Without conscious thought, he reached for her hand, enclosing it in his larger one. "Thank you," he said simply. They sat like that for several moments, the contact speaking what words still couldn't. When Howard's footsteps finally sounded on the porch, they separated naturally, returning to their tasks as though nothing momentous had occurred. But something had, and they both knew it. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold. Colton woke early, as was his habit, and slipped out to tend to the horses before the kings rose. When he returned, stamping snow from his boots, he found Hannah in the kitchen, already preparing breakfast. "Merry Christmas," she greeted him cheerfully. "Father will be down shortly. He always sleeps late on holidays." Colton nodded, suddenly self-conscious about the small package he'd hidden in his coat pocket. He'd ridden to Virginia City the week before, ostensibly to pick up a special order for Howard, but also to find something for Hannah. The shop had been decorated with a small pine tree in the corner, and presents were arranged beneath it. After breakfast, Howard insisted they open gifts immediately, before customers start arriving with their holiday ailments. Howard received a new pipe from Hannah, and a handcrafted chess set from Colton, who had carved the pieces during evenings in his room. The older man was delighted with both, declaring the chess set would surely help him finally best judge Parker. Hannah opened her father's gift first, a beautiful new shawl in deep green wool. "To match your eyes," Howard said fondly. When it was time for Colton's gift, he hesitated, then withdrew the small package from his pocket and handed it to her wordlessly. Hannah unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small journal bound in soft leather with a pressed wildflower embedded in its cover. "Oh, Colton," she breathed, tracing the preserved bloom with her fingertip. "It's beautiful." "Desert lavender," he said. "The one you said bends but doesn't break." Her eyes shone with emotion. "How did you preserve it so perfectly?" "Grandmother taught me, for her herbals." He shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "Thought you might want to record your remedies, create your own book." Hannah clutched the journal to her chest. "It's perfect." "Absolutely perfect." She reached beneath the tree for a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. "This is for you." Inside, Colton found a hand-knitted scarf in a deep indigo blue, accompanied by a small tin. When he opened the latter, the familiar scent of juniper berries mixed with something sweeter met his nose. "A salve," Hannah explained, "for your hands when they pain you in cold weather. I've noticed you rubbing them on winter mornings." He stared at her, astonished that she'd observed something he barely acknowledged himself. The old battlefield injury sometimes made his joints ache, but he'd grown so accustomed to it that he rarely thought about it consciously. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate for what he felt. Howard watched their exchange with knowing eyes, but said nothing beyond expressing his own thanks for the gifts he'd received. That evening, after a day of receiving visitors and modest holiday celebrations, Colton stood on the back porch of the shop, watching stars emerge in the clear winter sky. The new scarf was wrapped around his neck, its warmth a constant reminder of Hannah's thoughtfulness. The door opened behind him, and Hannah stepped out, wrapped in her coat and the new shawl. "Beautiful night," she observed, coming to stand beside him. Colton nodded. "Reminds me of Pennsylvania. Winter nights so clear you could count every star. You miss it," he considered the question. "Sometimes. The place, not the time, can't go back to who I was then." "None of us can," she agreed. "We're always becoming something new." She glanced at him. "Do you still plan to leave when winter ends?" The question he'd been avoiding. When he'd taken the job, it had been with the explicit understanding that it was temporary, just until spring made travel possible again. Now, with January approaching, that departure loomed closer. "Don't know," he admitted. "I'd like you to stay," Hannah said simply. "Father would too. The business is growing and you've become essential to its operation." "Just the business?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. Hannah turned to face him fully, snowflakes catching in her hair like tiny stars. "No, Colton Waite, not just the business." He met her gaze, finding courage there that had eluded him on a dozen battlefields. "I'm not good with words, not like you. You're better than you think." And getting better every day, she smiled. Besides, I talk enough for both of us. Something like laughter rumbled in his chest. True enough. Hannah reached for his hand, her touch warm despite the cold night. You don't need poetry, Colton, just truth. Truth is, he said slowly, each word deliberate, I've never met anyone like you, never thought I could feel. He gestured vaguely with his free hand, searching for the right expression. Alive again, she suggested gently. He nodded, grateful for her understanding. Yes, alive. Hannah stepped closer, the space between them charged with possibility. That's a good start, I think. And then, with the stars witnessing what words still couldn't fully express, Colton leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning at first, then deepening as Hannah responded, her hand coming up to rest against his chest. When they parted, Colton found words he'd never said before waiting on his tongue. I think I'm falling in love with you, Hannah King. Her smile was brighter than all the stars above Nevada. I know I'm falling in love with you, Colton Waite. They stood together in the winter night, the future unfolding before them like a path neither had expected to find. New Year's Eve brought a celebration at the Carson City Hotel. The entire town turned out in their finest clothes, eager to welcome 1876 with music, dancing, and good cheer. Howard insisted they all attend, declaring that even apothecaries deserve a night of frivolity now and then. Colton owned no formal attire, but Howard lent him a decent jacket that fit well enough across the shoulders. Hannah wore a dress of deep burgundy that Colton had never seen before, her hair arranged in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck. You look. He began when she appeared in the shop where he waited. Yes, she prompted, eyes twinkling at his loss for words. Beautiful, he finished simply. Like autumn leaves before the first snow, her eyes widened at the unexpected poetry. Now who's talking to flowers? He offered his arm, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Must be your influence. The hotel ballroom was decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, lanterns casting a golden glow over the assembled townsfolk. A small orchestra played in the corner, and couples already filled the dance floor. Colton had never been comfortable at such gatherings, even before the war stripped away his social graces. He stood awkwardly at the edge of the room, watching as Hannah was greeted warmly by friends and acquaintances. Quite a different scene from trail camps, eh? A voice at his elbow made him turn. Sheriff Miller stood beside him, a glass of punch in hand. The lawman had been a regular customer at the apothecary, coming in for headache powders and liniment for an old shoulder injury. Colton nodded. Sir, King tells me you've been a godsend to his business, Miller continued. Says you've got a way with the delivery routes that's cut complaints in half. Just doing the job. The sheriff studied him over the rim of his glass. Planning to stay on then, Colton found his gaze drawn to Hannah, who was laughing at something Judge Parker's wife had said. Yes, he said with certainty, if they'll have me. Miller clapped him on the shoulder. Good man, Carson City could use more steady types like you. He lowered his voice. And between us, Miss King has never looked happier than she has these past months. Before Colton could respond, the music changed to a waltz, and Hannah appeared before them. Sheriff, would you mind terribly if I stole Mr. Waite away for a dance? She asked with a charming smile. Miller tipped his hat. Not at all, Miss King. I was just heading over to rescue my wife from Mrs. Davenport's gossip. As the sheriff departed, Hannah turned expectant eyes to Colton. Well, Mr. Waite, will you dance with me? Panic flashed across his face. I don't. It's been years since. It's just like riding a horse, she assured him, taking his hand. Your feet will remember what to do. Before he could protest further, she had led him onto the dance floor. Awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence, Colton placed one hand at her waist, the other clasping hers as they began to move with the music. "See," Hannah murmured. "Your body remembers." And remarkably, it did. The steps came back to him from long ago, lessons his mother had insisted upon, his body falling into rhythm with Hannah's as though they'd danced together 100 times before. "Where did you learn to dance?" she asked as they circled the floor. "My mother, before she died, said every gentleman should know how." Hannah's eyes softened. "She was right, and you dance beautifully." As the music continued, Colton gradually relaxed, becoming less concerned with his footwork and more aware of the woman in his arms. Hannah's eyes never left his, her trust in him evident in every movement. "I've decided to stay," he said abruptly as they turned near the edge of the floor. Hannah missed a step, quickly recovering. "In Carson City," he nodded, "if your father still wants help with the business." "And if I want more than your help with the business?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the music. Colton's hand tightened slightly at her waist. "What do you want, Hannah?" "Everything," she answered simply. "A partnership, a future. A life where you speak not just to me, but to our children about the stars in Pennsylvania and the blue flowers in Wyoming." The word children sent a jolt through him, not of fear, but of possibility he'd never allowed himself to imagine. "I'm still broken in places," he warned. Hannah's smile was gentle. "We all are, but broken things can be mended, Colton. Sometimes they're stronger for having been repaired." As the music drew to a close, he made a decision. Instead of releasing her and stepping back as propriety demanded, he kept her close, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I love you, Hannah King. Have for months now, I think, just didn't have words for it." Her eyes shone with unshed tears. "You have them now." "Because of you," he acknowledged. "You taught me to speak again." "And you taught me that listening can be as powerful as talking," she replied, "even to someone who chatters to wildflowers." The orchestra began another song, but they remained still, the moments suspended between them like a fragile bubble. "Hannah," Colton said, his voice rough with emotion, "would you consider becoming my wife?" Her answer was immediate and radiant. "Yes, with all my heart, yes." The news of their engagement spread through Carson City like wildfire. Howard gave his blessing without hesitation, confessing he'd been hoping for this outcome since autumn. "I've never seen my daughter so happy," he told Colton privately. "Nor have I seen a man more transformed by love. You're good for each other." They were married in early May 1876, when the wildflowers carpeted the Nevada hillsides in a riot of color. The ceremony was held in the meadow where they'd first met, with Judge Parker officiating and most of Carson City in attendance. Hannah wore a simple white dress adorned with fresh blossoms, and Colton stood tall in a new suit, his face clean-shaven, his eyes clear and present in a way they hadn't been for years. When it came time for vows, Hannah spoke eloquently of finding love where she least expected it, of the quiet strength she'd discovered in Colton, of the future they would build together. When his turn came, a momentary flash of panic crossed Colton's face. Then he reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "I wrote this," he said, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness, "because I wanted to get the words right." He unfolded the paper and began to read. "Hannah, before you my world was silent. Not just because I chose few words, but because I'd stopped listening to life around me. You showed me how to hear again the whispers of plants, the stories in silence, the truth between words. I promise to listen to you always, even when you're talking to wildflowers. I promise to speak truth, even when it's difficult. I promise to build a life where our children will know both the value of words and the meaning of silence. You found me when I was lost, brought me back to myself, taught me words I never knew to say. Most importantly, you taught me these: I love you today and all our days to come. By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the meadow. Hannah reached up to touch his face. Her own words momentarily failed her. "Now who's the poet?" she finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with tables set up under the stars, lanterns glowing against the gathering darkness, music and laughter filling the spring air. As night fell, Colton led his new wife away from the festivities, back to the spot among the wildflowers where they'd first met. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his jacket. He withdrew a small bouquet of desert lavender, carefully preserved like the flower in her journal cover. "It bends but doesn't break," he said, repeating her words from their first meeting. "Like you, like us." Hannah accepted the gift with shining eyes. Who would have thought that taciturn cowboy who found me talking to buttercups would turn out to be the love of my life? "The flowers knew," Colton said with a small smile. "They're excellent listeners." Hannah laughed, the sound merging with the night breeze rustling through the meadow. "Indeed they are. And what do they tell you now?" Colton pulled her close, his arms encircling her waist. "That we've only just begun our story." The years that followed proved him right. Howard eventually retired, turning the apothecary business over to them completely. Colton expanded the delivery routes, while Hannah's remedies became famous throughout Nevada territory. Their knowledge complemented each other perfectly, her intuitive understanding of plants, balanced by his practical approach to business and distribution. Their first child, a son they named James Howard Waite, arrived in the spring of 1877, with Howard proudly declaring the boy had his grandmother's eyes and his mother's determination. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Margaret Rose, who from her earliest days showed signs of inheriting her mother's gift with plants and her father's quiet thoughtfulness. By 1885, King's Remedies had become Waite and King Apothecary, with a larger shop on Carson City's Main Street and a reputation that extended throughout the region. Hannah had published 2 books on Western medicinal plants, illustrated with Colton's careful pressed specimens. Their children grew strong and curious, James showing an aptitude for the business side while Margaret followed her mother into the study of botanical medicine. Through it all, Colton remained a man of measured words, but they were meaningful ones, rich with the love and purpose he'd found in Carson City. He still preferred the quiet of delivery routes to the bustle of town, still watched stars on clear nights and remembered Pennsylvania skies. But now he shared these things with his family, his silence no longer a fortress, but a gift he offered alongside his carefully chosen words. And Hannah still spoke to wildflowers, still found joy in their silent communion. But she had also learned the value of quiet moments, of waiting for Colton's thoughts to form themselves into speech, of the eloquence in a single, heartfelt word. On their 20th anniversary, they returned to the meadow where they'd met. The spring had been particularly wet, and buttercups carpeted the ground in waves of bright yellow. They brought a picnic and their teenagers, who good-naturedly endured their parents' reminiscences before wandering off to explore the ridge. As evening approached and the children gathered wildflowers nearby, Colton took Hannah's hand, his thumb tracing the lines that years of work had etched into her palm. "Happy?" he asked, the question containing multitudes. Hannah leaned against his shoulder, watching their children laughing in the distance. "Beyond measure," she replied. "And you?" Colton looked out over the Nevada landscape that had become more home to him than any place he'd ever known. 20 years ago, he'd been a shell of a man, moving through the world without truly inhabiting it. Now he was husband, father, respected businessman, and most miraculous of all, a man who had found his voice again. "I found everything here I never knew I was looking for," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You taught me more than words, Hannah. You taught me how to live again." "We taught each other," she corrected gently, "and we're still learning." As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, painting the wildflowers in gold and shadow, Colton thought about the strange and wonderful journey that had brought him to this moment. How a chance encounter with a woman who spoke to flowers had changed the course of his life entirely. "What are you thinking?" Hannah asked, noticing his contemplative expression. Colton smiled, the gesture coming naturally to him now in a way it never had before he met her. "That sometimes the most important journeys take us exactly where we need to be, even when we don't know we're looking." Hannah's eyes crinkled at the corners, the same sage green that had captured his attention all those years ago. "My taciturn cowboy has become quite the philosopher." "Had a good teacher," he replied, drawing her closer as their children started back toward them, arms full of wildflowers and faces bright with youth. Together they watched the day fade into evening, the first stars appearing overhead like distant promises. The desert lavender bent in the breeze but did not break, just as Hannah had told him that first day. Just as they had learned to do together, through all the joys and sorrows life had brought their way. And in the gentle Nevada twilight, surrounded by wildflowers and family, the once silent cowboy found he had all the words he needed, and a lifetime still to say them.